Hello and welcome back to Curmudgeon Media. My name's Tom and I've got something special in store for you today. Because today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into one of the greatest pieces of fiction of all time. Alan Moore's seminal 1986 comic book, Watchmen. Watchmen sure has been getting a lot of attention recently, hasn't it? A bunch of spin-off comics and graphic novels, a critically acclaimed HBO series, and... oh, I guess I'm kinda late to the party for that one. Nevertheless, it's got me looking back at Alan Moore's original story, the one that started it all. That a comic published over 30 years ago is still echoing today is a testament to its quality and the social commentary packed within its pages. I'm not just talking about spin-offs and adaptations here. You can see glimpses of Watchmen in similar works like The Boys and... hey, The Boys, that's still recent, right? This video is relevant, isn't it? I mean, Alan Moore really is in a league of his own in many ways. You never get the impression he cares too much about high art or low art. In the words of Dave Gibbons, the artist who brought Watchmen to life, Moore sees comics on the same continuum as novels and movies, and would apply the same critical and creative disciplines. But beyond that, the sheer amount of effort and detail he puts into his writing is a cut above the rest. While most writers hand over 32-page documents, Moore has consistently dealt in 150 pages or more. According to Watchmen editor Barbara Kessel,
Alan would give you the complete psychological profile of each character, plus the meaning of every object in the environment.
Somewhere along the line, Moore got the idea to write a superhero story utilising disused characters with whom he could basically do whatever he wanted.
I just started thinking about using the MLJ characters, just because they weren't being published at the time, and for all I knew, they might have been up for grabs.
That is to say, Moore was initially planning on rebranding superheroes from MLJ, now Archie Comics, with whom he could deviate from the traditional superhero narrative. Within the world which he would weave, Moore would reveal a reality that was very different to the general public image of the superhero. In other words, the mythology surrounding the superhero image was being primed for deconstruction. Obviously, Moore's proposal was a success, but he was met with resistance. Mainly, DC's vice president and executive editor, Dick Giordano, had no intention of handing over a bunch of characters who wouldn't have survived the story.
DC realised their expensive characters would either end up dead or dysfunctional.
By Giordano's recommendation, Moore began shaping his own original characters using the Chilton superheroes as a template. It's pretty straightforward to map this out actually. You can quite easily draw a line connecting Captain Atom to Dr. Manhattan, for example. Both characters are superheroes with a nuclear edge and the shadow of the atom bomb looming ominously above them. With the indispensable hands of artist Dave Gibbons and colorist John Higgins, Moore brought Watchmen into fruition. In Gibbons' own words, the crew realised that they could create their own archetypes and tell a story about all superheroes. What were their motivations? How would their very existence change the world? Alan Moore was equally concerned with the socio-historical climate though.
The 80s were worrying. Mutually assured destruction, voodoo economics, a culture of complacency. I was writing about the times I was living in.
Watchmen is preoccupied at once with the culture of superheroes, the mythos, so to speak, while also being concerned with the contemporary zeitgeist, the mythos that they were living in. Watchmen begins with a murder. Eddie Blake, the alter ego of ex-hero The Comedian, is found slathered all over the pavement beneath his skyrise apartment like a disgusting piece of toast. Enter Rorschach, aka Walter Kovacs, the character whose image is most synonymous with Watchmen. Next to the blood-stained smiley, the formless, shifting blobs of Rorschach's mask are something of an icon. The character's centrality to the story is befitting of his iconography though. Rorschach provides most of the narration and is thus our waypoint into the narrative. Rorschach is a ruthless, unforgiving vigilante with a penchant for violence. At the time of Blake's death, Rorschach remains the only active masked hero. After confirming that Blake is the comedian, Rorschach theorizes that someone is out for blood. Superhero blood. His suspicion of a hero killer throws him into contact with old associates, fellow members of a now-defunct team of vigilantes called Crime Busters. Among them, Dan Dryberg, aka Night Owl, Adrian Veidt, aka Ozymandias, Laurie Uspechik, aka Silk Spectre, and John Osterman, aka Dr. Manhattan. For the sake of, time, I'll leave the plot at that and visit specific plot elements as and when the occasion arises. Let's have a look at these characters. Night Owl 2 is your typical Batman type deal. He's got the most elaborate costume of the bunch, he makes his own gadgets, hell, he's practically got his own Batcave, if not a little toned down. Beyond that, his abilities mostly revolve around his advanced combat skills. Similar in this regard is Silk Spectre, though she doesn't come equipped with a vast array of devices or a utility belt. I lump these two characters together for the fact that they're the most ordinary of the bunch. They're basically acrobats with superior aptitude in battle. Ozymandias, while also an unparalleled fighter and a literal acrobat, is a cut above on account of his ridiculous intellect. Dubbed the smartest man alive, a title which he humbly brushes off for the most part, Vight's brain could be considered somewhat superhuman. The comedian is easily the most morally reprehensible of the roster. Murderer, attempted rapist, gun-toting lunatic, he's made plenty of enemies and he really doesn't care. Even more so, he actively revels in the nihilistic brutality of life. To him, it's nothing but a big joke, hence the name. The comedian is one of the only two masked vigilantes to be willingly conscripted by the government. As such, to describe him as militaristic would be an understatement. The second to be conscripted is Dr. Manhattan, who's on a different level entirely. He's the only true superhero of the roster, boasting an omniscient consciousness and the ability to literally manipulate matter on a molecular level. He's more or less a god. He also perceives all of history at once, he can teleport, and he's immortal. So yeah, more or less a god. Moore's take on superheroes is scrutinizing down to their very fabric. The world he creates primes the very concept of superheroes for criticism.
In contrast to the golden age of comics of the 1930s and 40s, these three Dark Age comics, Crisis on Infinite Earths, Watchmen, and The Dark Knight Returns, spawned a standard of moral ambiguity and a demolition of heroic mythology.
A pretty bold statement, huh? Mythology. I've thrown that word around a few times, but it really is essential to understanding Watchmen and why it's so brilliant. Initially, I had planned to divide this video into two sections, realism and mythology. My original idea revolved around talking about Moore's realistic take on the superhero archetype and then delving into this quote-unquote demolition of mythology separately. But as my extremely unsuccessful career as an asphalt paver has taught me, things rarely work out so smoothly. Watchmen is not a story so simple as to be neatly picked apart like a fresh corpse, ripe for the autopsying. It's more like a corpse that's been stewing underground for a few months, mystifying the cause of death and... I think this metaphor's getting wildly out of hand. In either case, here's my point. The realistic take which Moore adopts in Watchmen is so closely intertwined with American mythology that the two are tied in many ways. So what do I mean by mythology? Are we talking about mythology the likes of ancient Greece, something Herculean? Well, when I say myth, I refer to a widespread idea that carries ideological, social, or cultural meaning. This can mean a Herculean myth, a story with gods and monsters, but it could also mean something a little more amorphous. The American dream is an excellent example of this. In fact, the good old star-spangled American dream is something which we'll return to later. Superheroes are a form of myth. Umberto Eco's 1972 text, The Myth of Superman, outlines this in fairly simple terms.
In an industrial society where man becomes a number in the realm of the organization which has usurped his decision-making role, he has no means of production and is thus deprived of his power to decide. In such a society, the positive hero must embody to an unthinkable degree the power demands that the average citizen nurtures but cannot satisfy.
So, the mythical identity of a superhero is a method of wish fulfillment for the disenfranchised masses. Eco goes on to state,
From a mythopoeic point of view, Clark Kent personifies fairly typically the average reader who is harassed by complexes and despised by his fellow men. Through an obvious process of self-identification, any accountant in any American city secretly feeds the hope that one day, from the slough of his actual personality, a Superman can spring forth who is capable of redeeming years of mediocre existence.
In the modern world, the flights of fancy of fantastical fables, like those of Superman, are mythological because they fulfill a mass cultural desire. This is something which Moore seemingly recognizes and voices in the comic. Let's talk about Dan Dreiberg for a moment, Night Owl 2. In issue 7, A Brother to Dragons, Dreiberg and Uspechik share an awkward sexual encounter. After a fallout with Dr. Manhattan, Uspechik takes refuge in Dreiberg's home and the two grow closer by the day. The more we hover the magnifying glass over Dryburgh, the more he resembles Clark Kent, though he isn't acting. He's truly nervous and neurotic in many ways. He's timid like a deer in headlights. Most importantly, however, he has long since dropped the cape and spandex act for a fairly regular, if not plain, lifestyle. He and Yespechik share a romantic moment after she notes his ravishing good looks without glasses, perhaps another poetic symmetry with Clark Kent. One thing leads to another, and pretty soon the clothes come off. But, like most men his age, he suffers a little engine trouble, to put it delicately. This is the reality behind the myth, and it's essential to how Alan Moore murders that myth. He's the real Clark Kent, the disenfranchised white-collar man of Echo's musings, whose very existence is mediocre. His impotence is more than just literal, it's an analogue for the impotence experienced by the average Joe. This is the importance of the superhero myth. It's a manifestation of the desires of the powerless. It's fitting that it takes a return to vigilantism to cure Dryburgh of his engine trouble. By drawing attention to this, Moore is deconstructing the myth, reverse engineering it, in a manner of speaking, taking it back to its pitiful roots. So, we've explored the mythological aspect a little. So how does Moore see to the death of mythology, so to speak? For the sake of simplicity, I've picked two characters which I feel perfectly embody Moore's take: Dr. Manhattan and Rorschach. When I said that Alan Moore's realism is integral to his murdering of mythology, I had Dr. Manhattan in mind. This realistic take on the Superman is all part of the death of the superhero myth and much, much more. But all in good time. In order to understand Moore's realistic take on the Superman, we need to take a closer look at Dr. Manhattan's trajectory and how he is perpetually related to the nuclear phenomenon. There is a prophetic quality to the death of John Osterman and the birth of Dr. Manhattan. His non-linear perception of time makes it so. The events, as he calmly, if not indifferently, narrates to us, are inevitable. The beginning of Osterman's trajectory is the atomic bomb. August 7th, 1945, 16-year-old John Osterman practices repairing a pocket watch with the aim of becoming a watchmaker. His father bursts into the room brandishing a newspaper, its front page distinguished by the shape of a mushroom cloud. "Forget pocket watches. Have you seen the news?" his father says. "They dropped the atomic bomb on Japan. A whole city gone. These are no times for a repairer of watches." This changes everything. By 1958, Osterman graduates with a PhD in atomic physics. The coming of the nuclear age is codified into the character from the start. By 1959, Osterman falls in love with Janie Slater, a character who's something of a footnote, but nonetheless central to the incident that changes everything. It's July 1959. I'm returning to New Jersey on vacation, visiting old university friends. Janie shares the trip from Arizona. Her mother lives in Jersey. She calls home from the station, but nobody answers. We visit the amusement park, killing time until her mother returns. When Janie's watch strap breaks, a fat man steps on it before they can retrieve it. The fat man, obviously a nod to the nuclear bomb of the same name, is the next piece of the puzzle. Osterman fixes her watch, but leaves it in his lab coat in the IF chamber. He returns for the watch, but the chamber door shuts behind him and locks automatically. The generators warm up for this afternoon's experiment. Osterman is fried in the nuclear testing facility. There is nothing left to bury. Shortly after, Dr. Manhattan pieces himself together out of nothing. A news anchor declares the Superman exists and he is American. Janie is scared because everything's changed. The various references tying Dr. Manhattan to the nuclear phenomenon are numerous, deliberate, and incredibly relevant. Even his name is a reference to the famous Manhattan Project which yielded the first nuclear weaponry. Alan Moore uses the real-world reaction to the atomic bomb to render his fictional world's reaction to Dr. Manhattan in a more realistic light. This is written into the text in various ways, both subtle and overt. For example, note how Janie reacts to Osterman's transformation exactly how Osterman's father reacted to the bomb, both declaring that everything has changed. Arguably, the most essential parallel occurs in issue 4, after Dr. Manhattan is conscripted by the US government to intervene in the Vietnam War. It's May. I've been here 2 months. The Viet Cong are expected to surrender within the week. Many have given themselves up already. Often they ask to surrender to me personally, their terror of me balanced by an almost religious awe. I am reminded of how the Japanese were reported to have viewed the atomic bomb after Hiroshima. Much akin to the world's horrifying sublimation of the nuclear phenomenon, the coming of Dr. Manhattan is met with a very real sense of awe and dread. Moore's deliberate use of nuclear iconography makes Dr. Manhattan's effect on the world significantly more real. But through this realism, Moore completely shatters the popularised depiction of the Superman who sees naught but adoration and praise. The myth is beginning to rot. Moore's nuclear references go deeper, but we'll come back to that in due course. Let's move away from the nuclear metaphor for a moment and analyse the character himself. What about Moore's depiction of this Superman makes it realistic, per se? Well, let's see what Umberto Eco has to say.
Each of these heroes is gifted with such powers that he could actually take over the government, defeat the army, or alter the equilibrium of planetary politics. On the other hand, it is clear that each of these characters is profoundly kind, moral, faithful to human and natural laws, and therefore it is right and it is nice that he uses powers only to the end of good.
We're dealing with beings in possession of astronomical levels of power, yet their undoubtable code of ethics maintains their humanity. But is this not a paradox? Eco goes on to state that the immortal Superman would no longer be a man but a god, and the public's identification with his double identity would fall by the wayside. But what about the god's identification, or lack thereof, with the public? Surely a creature of a Superman's magnitude wouldn't be human. Dr. Manhattan isn't human, and Moore is certain to realise this. It's February 1960 and everything is frozen, says Osterman. I'm starting to accept that I shall never feel cold or warm again. Dr. Manhattan's divine levels of power make it so that he loses his grasp of humanity. With it, he loses his ability to care. The morality of my activities escapes me, he declares, as he separates a mobster's head from his shoulders. To him, we are nothing. Nowhere is this more prevalent than in Issue 2, Absent Friends. As the remaining ex-members of Crime Busters watch Eddie Blake's casket descend into the earth, they reflect on their experiences with him. Rewind to America's victory in the Vietnam War. Having both been conscripted to assist with war efforts, Osterman and Blake share a dialogue in a local tavern. The two are approached by a pregnant Vietnamese woman carrying Blake's child. Blake, being the upstanding citizen that he is, shirks his responsibility. I cannot walk away from what grows in my belly, she says to him. Well, that's unfortunate because that's just what I'm gonna do. Forget you, forget your cruddy little country, all of it. In a blind rage, she slashes Blake's face with the greeting end of a broken bottle. Mutilated and bleeding, Blake shoots the pregnant woman to death, right before Osterman's eyes. Osterman weakly protests, Blake, don't do it. Blake does, however, make a pertinent and harrowing point. Indeed, he shot her dead, but what did Osterman do? What did the most powerful being on the planet do to stop him? You could have changed the gun into steam, or the bullets into mercury, or the bottle into snowflakes, but you didn't lift a finger. You're drifting out of touch, Doc. You're turning into a flake. God help us all. There is an increasing distance between Dr. Manhattan and the human race as the story progresses. Unlike the archetypal Superman, Dr. Manhattan is not all good or all noble. The moral fabric of the Superman upon which the myth is teetering has totally collapsed. Moore doesn't just subvert the myth of Superman of which Eco writes, he kills it. But again, mythology is as much a social thing as it is a narrative thing. It's worth noting that the concept of change, hard cultural change, is as central to Dr. Manhattan as the atomic metaphor. This change and the nuclear age cannot be considered separately. As Mary C. Brennan suggests,
the development of hostilities between the United States and the Soviet Union seemed to make the world a more dangerous place by creating the potential for armed conflict. In a nuclear age, that potential threatened even to include civilians in small towns and large cities in the American heartland.
The event of nuclear armament ushered in an age of anxiety for the potential of worldwide destruction. This destruction is felt in its totality by the domestic masses. People were living constantly under the threat of global cataclysm.
If we should ever have a nuclear war, we could get a heavy fallout even though we were not anywhere near the target area.
With that in mind, 1986 stands as a point in the future in Watchmen, a future whose very existence is threatened by the possibility of nuclear annihilation. So what myth exactly is being killed in this instance? This question is a little harder to answer and is a whole lot more nebulous. In this case, the myth is more a way of living, the fabric of life itself. The coming of the nuclear age tainted day-to-day existence with anxiety like no other. The coming of Dr. Manhattan is no different. Alan Moore voices this through an essay written by the fictional Professor Milton Glass in issue 4. Professor Glass states, "I do not believe we have a man to end wars. I believe that we have made a man to end worlds," echoing the sentiment that the nuclear bomb was itself the weapon to end wars. In this light, we are all of us living in the shadow of Manhattan. The anxiety over nuclear oblivion, which even permeated domestic life, is expertly woven into Moore's depiction of the Superman. It wouldn't be unusual to draw a connotative link to the haunting words of J. Robert Oppenheimer, the father of the atomic bomb.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
As you've probably noticed, there's an almost religious stigmatism surrounding Dr. Manhattan. From the sublime terror thrust upon him by the Viet Cong to the sheer sense of divine cataclysm evoked by his connection to Oppenheimer's famous quote. There's another Milton Glass quote that comes to mind. "God exists, and he's American." If that statement starts to chill you after a couple of moments' consideration, then don't be alarmed. A feeling of intense and crushing religious terror at the concept indicates only that you are still sane. This brings us neatly onto the final and most disturbing aspect of Dr. Manhattan's relevance to the death of mythology. The thing with John Osterman is that he represents more than just the death of the Superman myth. He embodies the death of the greatest myth of the Western world. He embodies the death of God. The sheer religiosity with which characters view and describe Dr. Manhattan leaves a lingering sense that he's usurped God. What's unique about the "God exists" quote is that Osterman has quite literally taken God's place, semantically. He's killed God, and now he wears his skin whether he chooses to or not. But his omniscient, all-knowing, all-encompassing consciousness makes him privy to that which some do not want to know. Perhaps the single most essential quote from Osterman throughout the entire saga is this: "Who makes the world? Perhaps the world is not made. Perhaps nothing is made. Perhaps it simply is, has been, will always be there. A clock without a craftsman." So what about this death of God? What does it matter? J. Edgar Hoover believed that without God as the centre, there would be no moral guidelines and society would fall into chaos. Not only would Americans lose their everyday freedoms, but their families would be destroyed as well. Of course, this is reactionary and just a little bit, stupid, but the point remains. In a Cold War world, the existence of such a being as Dr. Manhattan means the usurping of God. And without God, the mythological framework begins to fall apart. In other words,
This scenario contrasted sharply with the American ideal.
You might also recall Nietzsche harbouring this very belief. Yes, I'm referencing Nietzsche, as pretentious and edgy as that may sound, but nevertheless, here's a handy summary.
If God is dead, what comes next? That's the question Nietzsche asked himself. His answer was that it left us without a basis for morality. Our ideas of right and wrong and good and evil make sense in a world where there is a God. They don't in a godless one. Take away God and you take away the possibility of clear guidelines about how we should live, which things to value.
I'd like to say that's that as far as this whole death of God business is concerned, but really we're just getting started. There's a hell of a lot more to discuss, and it doesn't end with Dr. Manhattan. Next up on the agenda, it's the face, can I call that a face? That most people would associate with Watchmen. Rorschach. Rorschach is as crucial to Watchmen as he is iconic. In the following section, I'm going to explain how Moore uses Rorschach to deconstruct a core aspect of superhero mythos, moral absolutism. In doing so, Moore annihilates how we perceive the superhero myth, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. The life of Walter Kovacs is something of a tragedy. His mother was a prostitute. The silhouette of her writhing body in a stranger's embrace was etched into his brain from an early age. That mental picture has been hammered into his memory by the back of his mother's fist. His childhood isn't exactly the epitome of the dream urban landscape. It seems that Kovacs was exposed to the seediness of humanity from day one. Next thing you know, it's 1951. Little innocent Wally is putting out a lit cigarette in the eye of a teenage tormentor. They grow up so fast. Fast forward to 1956. When informed of his mother's brutal murder, he restricted his comments to one word: good. At 16, he finds unskilled manual work in the textiles industry. Fast forward again to 1962, he's entranced with a fascinating dress. Viscous fluids between two layers latex, heat and pressure sensitive, Customer young girl, Italian name, never collected order, said dress looked ugly. It is from this bizarre shifting pattern dress that Rorschach creates his iconic mask. It's his observation of the shapes, however, that are most interesting. Not ugly at all. Black and white, moving, changing shape but not mixing. No grey. Very, very beautiful. In case you hadn't guessed, this is symbolism. No grey, he says, hint hint. Regardless, we'll come back to that in due course. It's 1964 now, and the same woman who abandoned the dress makes the front page of the New York Gazette. The chalk outline of a body punctuates the headline, "Woman killed while neighbours look on." Raped, tortured, killed. Almost 40 neighbours heard screams. Nobody did anything. Some of them even watched. I knew what people were then. The sheer violent extremes of Rorschach's life experiences have driven him into a nihilistic pessimism. The realization of these extremes through Kovacs' development are integral to his philosophy, moral absolutism. Remember the black and white but no grey shtick from earlier? That right there symbolizes Rorschach's belief in moral absolutism. Moral absolutism revolves around the core idea that there is such a thing as an objective good, an objective bad, and no in-between. It would appear that Kovacs' intimate relationship with the extremes of human nature have indoctrinated him into the belief in moral extremes as well. In this final section of the video, I'm going to explore how moral absolutism applies to the mythology of the superhero as a whole, and how Alan Moore deconstructs that mythology through Rorschach. After all, the belief in an objectively distinguishable good and bad is deeply entrenched into superhero aesthetics. It's all part of how the storytellers justify violence as a means of maintaining justice. Likewise, it's essential to our suspension of disbelief.
They missed out all of the important kind of dialogue about violence and whether it's okay for someone to kill people just because they're the hero of a comic strip or movie. Why should somebody who's the title character, do they get a free pass? Whatever their behaviour is.
It's okay for Batman to viciously beat this dude to a pulp. He's the bad guy and Batman is the good guy, right? Right?
Stop! He's already dead!
So what's the problem with moral absolutism? Where does Kovacs' ideology begin to falter? To answer this, we have to take a look at the ending of Watchmen. It's revealed that Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias, is behind a convoluted plan to bring about the end of the Cold War. In his words, to frighten governments into cooperation, I would convince them that Earth faced imminent attack by beings from another world. Simply put, Veidt persuasively fakes an alien invasion to unite the global superpowers against a common enemy. Interestingly, Veidt's plan echoes a speech from Ronald Reagan in 1985. Just think how easy your task and mine might be in these meetings that we held if suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species from another planet outside in the universe. We'd forget all the little local differences that we have between our countries. As part of his plan, and as part of keeping the alien threat convincing, Veidt murders an entire city of innocent people. Veidt is, undoubtedly, a mass murderer. Furthermore, he leaves his fellow heroes in an uncomfortable position, and one which reveals the flaws of moral absolutism. They could bring him to justice, but to do so would be to reveal that the alien assault is a hoax. The death of all those people would be for nothing, and the planet would continue to cruise into nuclear catastrophe. A vow of silence is the only course of action. The heroes agree. All except Rorschach. Such a situation confounds any morally absolute thinker. Is it possible to do something bad for good reason? I won't answer that here, frankly I'm not smart enough, but the very existence of such a question completely shatters Rorschach's philosophy. Never compromise, evil must be punished, etc. The irony, of course, is that Rorschach has spent a sizable portion of his life murdering people for what he would describe as good reason. In the end, Rorschach is forced to confront the flaws inherent to his ideology. When apprehended by Dr. Manhattan, who understands the necessity to keep Veidt's secret, he cannot yield to the truth. As his ideology collapses in on itself, he practically begs for death. Moore has no shortage of criticisms of moral absolutism. After all, it is an expressly right-wing agenda, and Moore is quite openly left-wing. Moore suggests that the comic writer Steve Ditko, an outwardly right-wing thinker, partly inspired the character of Rorschach. In his own words,
Steve Ditko did have a very right-wing agenda, which of course he's completely entitled to, that probably led me to portraying Rorschach as an extremely right-wing character.
The reveal of right-wing extremist philosophy isn't just inherent to Rorschach, it forms a large part of Moore's deconstruction of the myth of superheroes as a whole. Take Ditko's own Spider-Man, for example. No, I'm not claiming that Spider-Man is right-wing, but consider this. The moment Peter Parker pummels a petty criminal, has he not made a lofty judgment as to an objective moral dichotomy? Who is and isn't deserving of capital punishment? More importantly, what gives him the right to make such a judgment? What's the difference between a superhero and an oppressor? Can you feel the myth of the superhero beginning to unravel? Let's talk about Eddie Blake for a moment. If the comedian demonstrates anything, it's just how easily this absolute code of ethics can teeter into tyranny and fascism. It is here that we can begin to understand how Moore debases the superhero mythology by chipping away at such characters' absolution. For example, in the 1970s, the world experiences an aggressive uprising against masked vigilantes. This uprising is what leads to the passing of the Keene Act in 1977, an act mandating the government conscription and regulation of vigilante behaviour. It's interesting to observe how the comedian chooses to contain the situation. Denizens are protesting in the streets. It gets a little rowdy. Sandwich boards are flying, cans and rocks are thrown haphazardly. It's looking like it could teeter over into a full-blown riot if it isn't one already. Night Owl too attempts diplomacy. Please, he says, if everybody will just clear the streets. Before Night Owl can finish speaking, the comedian takes a more confrontational route. Listen, you little punks, you better get back in your rat holes. I got riot gas, I got rubber bullets. It doesn't take long before the knives are out and the gas grenades are flying. The striking imagery of the protesting masses silenced by a violent tyrant sure does scream oppression, doesn't it? When an individual assigns themselves not just the power to discern between an objective good and bad, but also the authority to act upon it, it can so quickly devolve into fascism. Rorschach's outspoken admiration of Eddie Blake is something of a red flag, to be honest. In issue 6, as he sings Blake's praises, he simply states that the comedian understood man's capacity for horrors and never quit. He saw the world's black underbelly and never surrendered. Accompanying these words is the image of a broken, bloodied man struggling on the floor of an alleyway. Rorschach walks away from his victim in the background. What is the horrendous crime the man committed to deserve such absolute justice? He dared to protest the self-appointed authority of men like Blake, men like Kovacs. The comedian, Rorschach, these are devices with which Moore calls forth the decay of the superhero myth. Superheroes are by design morally absolute, and by deconstructing moral absolutism, he deconstructs superheroes as a whole. There's a greater force at play though, one which constitutes not just the death of the superhero myth, but also the death of a certain way of living, like I said before. To understand this, we need to ask a prevalent question. Why are people rioting? Why would the world turn its back on the vigilantes that it once heralded as heroes? To understand that, we need to return to that motif of the death of God. To reiterate J. Edgar Hoover's panicked claims, without God, the moral guidelines blur, and it is to the detriment of the quote-unquote American ideal. But let me provide an alternative observation. Is it the moral guidelines that blur? Or is it that the moral grey area is beginning to reveal itself? In this godless world, so to speak, how can anyone abide vigilantes? How can anyone stomach a rigid, binary moral framework exercised by executioners when the moral guidelines are no longer so clean-cut? That is why people are rioting, and given Blake's attempt to violently silence the protesters, who can blame them? Observe this iconic interaction between Night Owl and the comedian as they control the protests. The country is disintegrating, says Night Owl. What's happened to America? What's happened to the American dream? It came true. You're looking at it. There's an overwhelming sense that the myth of the ideal American lifestyle has begun to crumble. But it isn't that the rioting, the debauchery, the violence killed it. This is it, Blake states quite clearly. This violence is a result of the kind of moral authoritarianism embodied by masked heroes. It is the child of a society that once was founded on the moral binarism embodied by religiosity, the American ideal. The issue is that the death of God, the death of moral binarism, have made it unpalatable. That is why the myth has died. When we begin to question this moral framework, we begin to question the systems of power that put it in place. But it doesn't stop at that. The behaviour we see in Eddie Blake is all too relevant to the society we live in. In 2020, the world experienced civil unrest in light of systemic racism, particularly pertaining to the police. So here's my question for you. When we hand someone a badge and a gun, what's to stop them from misusing that authority? What's the difference between the comedian pelting protesters with rubber bullets and gas grenades and an armed police officer doing the same thing? When a man is functionally sentenced to death for the possession of a counterfeit banknote, our faith in these systems of power begins to fall apart, or at least it should fall apart. Their moral absolution is a myth, and it's deteriorating. Unfortunately, we can't just ignore how many people romanticize this behaviour. Moore has previously lamented the praise slung at Rorschach for exactly the brutality Moore had intended to deconstruct. In his own words,
I originally intended Rorschach to be a warning about the possible outcome of vigilante thinking, but an awful lot of comic readers felt his remorseless, frightening, psychotic toughness was his most appealing characteristic. It's not quite what I was going for.
perhaps this speaks to a larger culture that admires such behaviour and serves as a buttress to legitimise the same behaviour as it appears in law enforcement. Is it fair to say that the superhero genre is part of this? In romanticising masked heroes, do we romanticise vigilante violence? Do we proliferate the cultural belief that brutality is the driving principle of enforcing order? And how easily does that teeter over the edge into something unethical? I'm genuinely asking because I don't have the answer. Regardless, even posing these kinds of questions draws attention to the cultural mythos behind our love of superheroes. I'm personally not that fussed about the HBO Watchmen series, but I do think it was right to take Watchmen in the direction of police brutality. It at least furthered the discourse at play in Moore's original comic, and in a way that draws overt connections to the times we're living in, even if those connections are a little on the nose.
You know how you can tell the difference between a masked cop and a vigilante?
No.
Me neither.
Perhaps this is why a story like Watchmen is still so relevant today, and why it lives on in adaptation and spiritual succession. But I will never forgive Damon Lindelof for doing Alan Moore dirty like that, never. Thanks for watching, everyone. Seriously, thank you. This video has been a real passion project of mine, and I've put a ton of work into it, so if you've made it all the way to the end, thank you so much. Watchmen is by far one of the greatest stories ever written, and trying to piece together all my thoughts for this video was a challenge in itself. Huge thanks to Frank Filmic, Accounting for Games, Frankie and Jim from Jimdustries, and Curmudgeon Media's very own Green Ornstein for providing their wonderful voices for quotes. I'll link their channels in the description below, and you should absolutely give them your support. It's going to be a little while before I do another video this long, but I've got plenty of smaller content coming in the next few months, so stay tuned for that. Until next time, guys.